November 2015. A private members club in Soho, London. Mick Jagger was sitting alone at a dinner table, and a 28-year-old music journalist was explaining to his face why the Rolling Stones were finished. Mick said nothing. David Bowie was sitting at the far end of the same table. He heard every word. He set his wine glass down very slowly. He looked at the journalist, then he looked at Mick, and something moved behind his eyes that nobody in that room had seen coming. 12 minutes later, the journalist would wish he had eaten at home that evening. The event was the 40th anniversary dinner of Meridian Records, a small independent label that had survived 4 decades in an industry that ate small labels for breakfast and called it progress. 30 people. Round tables with white linen. Candles on every table because Helen Marsh, the label's founder, believed that candlelight was the only honest light for a music industry dinner. A string quartet in the corner playing something nobody was listening to. The kind of room where everyone knew everyone, except for one man who had arrived late, taken the end seat, and had not been introduced to the table's newest and most confident guest. The journalist's name was Oliver Nash. 28, senior music correspondent at one of London's largest entertainment publications. 40,000 Twitter followers. The absolute load-bearing certainty of someone who had never been seriously wrong about anything in front of a mirror. 3 pieces in the last year declaring classic rock officially dead, the artists who made it officially irrelevant. Each piece had done very well online. This had confirmed his theory entirely. Sharp suit, recorder on the table, technically off, practically ready. Oliver Nash was always professionally present, even when he was personally insufferable. He had a habit, at events like this, of arriving with a thesis and leaving with it confirmed. Tonight's thesis was that the old guard of British rock had held on too long, and that the industry's refusal to say so openly was a failure of journalistic nerve. He had spotted the silver-haired man across the table 20 minutes ago and assumed he was someone's guest. Someone's father, perhaps, the kind of man you invited out of obligation and seated away from the speakers. He had been waiting for a gap in the conversation. The gap came. The gap came. "You know what the problem is with the Stones?" Oliver said, leaning forward, voice carrying across the linen. Conversational? Confident. The tone of a man sharing an obvious truth with a patient audience. They had their moment. Genuinely extraordinary moment. I'd never take that from them. But that was 50 years ago. Today's audience doesn't know them, doesn't need them, and honestly doesn't care. Streaming numbers don't lie. The cultural conversation has moved on. He paused, picked up his glass. They should have stopped touring in the 90s. At least then people would remember them as they were. Mick Jagger said nothing. He was in his early 70s. Silver gray hair, tousled, slightly longer than fashionable. A deep purple fitted chiffon shirt, open at the chest, the kind of garment that had no business looking elegant in a candlelit Soho dining room, and managed it completely. No jacket, no tie, no watch worth noting. He had a glass of water in front of him and had been quiet for most of the evening. The specific quiet of a man who has heard everything worth hearing and no longer feels the need to compete with the room. When people spoke to him, he answered pleasantly without being revealing. He looked, to someone who hadn't placed him, like a man who had wandered in from somewhere else entirely and found the food acceptable. Oliver had assumed exactly that, which was his first mistake. Oliver was waiting for the man to respond, to argue, to defend the catalog, the tours, the legacy. Something. Mick took a small sip of water, looked at the tablecloth for a moment, then looked back at Oliver. "Maybe," he said. One word. That was all. Oliver took it as agreement. He kept going. He mentioned algorithms. He mentioned demographic data. He mentioned a piece he had written. Well received, actually. A lot of traction. About the economics of nostalgia and why classic rock's touring numbers were inflated by baby boomers who had nothing else to spend money on. At the far end of the table, a hand lifted a wine glass and set it down again on the white linen. The click was quiet enough that only Helen Marsh, 2 seats away, heard it. She looked at the man who had set it down. She felt the temperature of the room change. David Bowie was 68 years old. Silver-white hair swept back from his face with the precision of someone who had understood for 5 decades that appearance is a language and every choice in it means something. Dark suit, white shirt, no tie. A face so immediately recognizable that the human brain often refused to process it in ordinary social circumstances, preferring to decide it must be a coincidence, a resemblance, an error of light. He had arrived alone an hour ago, embraced Helen briefly at the door, and taken the end seat quietly, without ceremony. Most of the room had found reasons to become very busy with their conversations, because not everyone knows how to behave in front of a legend, and the ones who don't know generally pretend they do. Oliver Nash had not recognized him. He was still talking about demographic data and the aging of the classic rock consumer base. Bowie pushed back his chair. He stood up. Thin, considerably thinner than the 80s, and he moved with the deliberate precision of someone who has learned to carry himself in a way that draws attention toward intent. He walked around the outside of the table, slow, unhurried. He passed behind 2 seated guests without touching their chairs, moving with the economy of someone who had navigated stages and corridors for 50 years and learned to take up exactly the space a moment requires and not a fraction more. The room noticed. Conversations died in sequence, table by table, the way they die when something more important is happening. A woman near the window raised her hand to her mouth. A man in a dark jacket put his fork down. The string quartet played on for 4 more bars. Then one by one, the players stopped, not by instruction but by instinct, the way musicians stop when they feel the room no longer needs them. Oliver was mid-sentence when the footsteps stopped beside his chair. He looked up. Bowie was looking across the table at Mick, not at Oliver. He spoke as if Oliver were not there, which was, in a sense, accurate. "I haven't seen you since the garage," he said. Low voice, the voice of a man who trained himself to fill rooms larger than this one from a very early age and never lost the ability. "You look good." Mick looked up at him. For the first time all evening, he smiled. A real one. The kind that changes the whole geography of a face. "David," he said quietly, "I thought you weren't coming." "I wasn't," Bowie said. "Helen talked me into it." He looked at the empty chair beside Mick. "Is anyone sitting here?" "No." He sat down. Now. Oliver Nash's face. It was doing several things very rapidly, none of them intentional. The way a sentence looks when autocorrect catches it mid-word. Frozen. Rearranging. The pieces were arriving. He did not want them to arrive. They arrived anyway. David Bowie looked at Oliver Nash for the first time. "I heard what you said about the streaming numbers," he said pleasantly. "I think you're right that the numbers don't lie." He picked up the wine glass at that place and turned it once in his fingers. "They tell you exactly what was consumed, by whom, and when. What they don't tell you is why it mattered. They can't. That's not what they're built to do. He set the glass down. Journalism about music that uses only those numbers is like writing about a meal by listing the calories. Technically accurate. Completely wrong. He said it the way you say something, when you're not arguing, when you're simply correcting a factual error. Oliver opened his mouth. Nothing came out. You've met someone like Oliver Nash. Someone who has an opinion about everything and has never once been in the same room as the thing they have an opinion about. Someone who measures worth in numbers because numbers don't talk back. Drop a comment if you've ever watched someone like that get the answer they didn't expect. And tell us what happened. Stay with us, because what David Bowie does in the next 2 minutes is the reason nobody in that room ever forgot that evening. And none of them, not Helen, not the string quartet, not the waitstaff, ever spoke about it publicly. Mick was watching all of it. He had not moved. He had been sitting in rooms like this one for 50 years while other people debated his relevance, and he had learned the most powerful response to dismissal. Simply still be there. Present, patient. Let the room do the work. Helen Marsh was refilling her water glass with unnecessary precision. Bowie had not finished. The things that don't show up in numbers, he said, are things like this. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced something small. A folded piece of paper, worn at the creases, the kind that has been opened and closed many times. He placed it on the table in front of Oliver Nash. I've had that for 30 years. I've opened it when things were difficult. It's a note, 3 sentences, written backstage at Hammersmith in 1983. He looked across the table. He wrote it. I don't know if he remembers. Mick looked at the folded piece of paper. Something crossed his face. Something old. I remember, he said. The note never streamed, Bowie said. He looked at Oliver Nash. But it's still doing its job. Oliver was looking at the piece of paper. His recorder was still on the table. Technically off, practically forgotten. He was 28 years old. He had 40,000 Twitter followers. He had written pieces he had meant every word of. And now a man he had watched on screen since childhood was sitting 18 inches from him with a folded piece of paper between them. And the man was not angry. That was the worst part. Nobody was angry. Bowie looked at Oliver for a long moment. Then, you're not wrong that the world moves. It always does. The best music was never for the moment it was made. It was for all the later moments, the ones nobody could see yet when the record came out. He stood. He straightened his jacket. Write that story sometime. I think you'd be good at it. He walked back to his seat at the far end of the table. He sat down. He picked up his wine glass. He did not look at Oliver Nash again, not because he was making a point of it, but because the point had already been made and there was no reason to repeat it. The room exhaled. Slowly, as if the air had been held collectively for the previous 3 minutes and was only now being permitted to move again. Conversations restarted. The staff began to move. Someone asked for the bread. The string quartet, after a moment's consultation between players, began again. Oliver looked at the folded piece of paper still on the white linen, then at Mick. Mick looked back, still no anger, the same patience that had been there all evening. Can I ask you something? Oliver said. His voice was different, smaller. Yes, Mick said. What did you write in that note? Mick looked at the tablecloth, then back up. I wrote that he was the only person I knew who managed to change completely and stay exactly the same, and that this was the only real trick worth learning. He picked up his water glass. I still think that's true. Oliver picked up the folded paper, held it for a moment without opening it, then placed it carefully beside Mick's water glass. I think this belongs there, he said. Helen Marsh saw Mick's hand move toward it. She looked away. It was the most gracious thing anyone had done all evening, and probably the most important. Oliver left the dinner early. He didn't say goodbye to anyone. He walked through Soho in the November cold, with his hands in his pockets, and his recorder in his bag, and his thesis. The one he had arrived with, the one he had been so certain of. Somewhere behind him, on a white linen table. Past the record shops with their lights still on, the handwritten signs in the windows offering things nobody was buying at this hour. Past the musicians with cases on their backs heading somewhere or coming back. Past the bars where people were talking loudly about music without having made any. He didn't take his phone out once, which was unusual for him. The street was doing something he hadn't expected. It was sounding like something. He didn't have a word for it yet. He thought about that note, the folded piece of paper he had placed beside the water glass. He thought about the fact that it had been in a jacket pocket for 30 years and had apparently still been doing its job. He had a piece to write. He knew it would not be about streaming numbers. He knew it would not confirm the thesis he had arrived with. He knew it would not do well on social media. He wrote it anyway. He published it 6 weeks later. It was the best thing he ever wrote. It was read by a fraction of the audience his previous work had reached, and it was shared quietly, slowly, by people who sent it to other people with one line: "Read this." He never explained where it came from. In January 2016, David Bowie released an album that felt, to everyone who heard it, like a letter left on a table. 3 days later, he was gone. The world stopped the way it only stops for people who were genuinely irreplaceable, and then it continued, carrying the music with it the way it always does. Oliver Nash read the news at his desk. He sat for a long time without moving. Then he opened his desk drawer and took out a folded piece of paper that didn't belong to him and that he had never returned. He held it for a while. He never opened it. Some notes are not meant to be read by everyone. Some things do their work just by existing, just by being passed from one hand to another at the right moment. The music that lasts is never for the moment it was made. It's for all the later moments nobody could see yet. We'll leave you with something David Bowie once said, from a stage or an interview or somewhere in between, in a voice the world is still learning to live without. I don't know where I'm going from here, but I promise it won't be boring. If this story reminded you that what lasts is never what's loudest, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Another legend story is waiting for you right now. See you in the next one.